For the rest of my days, I will never forget the end of August 2017. I was in Oklahoma attending my father. At that point, a hurricane wasn't really on our radar, either literally or figuratively. Hurricane Harvey had made landfall almost 300 miles away from this place. And even though we were getting hit with a bit of rain from the storm system, I had no idea what would transpire in the next few days. After all, once a hurricane makes landfall, it usually dissipates. Things weren't going so well in Oklahoma, and so my wife, Carrie, sensing that I could use a bit of support, loaded the girls in the car and drove through the night so we could spend a single day together. They were planning on loading up the next day and coming back so they could be at school on Monday. And during that day, we uttered a term that we felt very guilty about later, the word hurrication. Our hope was that the remnant of Harvey would drop just enough rain that the school where Carrie teaches would be canceled on Monday, giving us an extra day together. We celebrated when the rain did cause a school cancellation, but the celebration was quickly subdued as the rain kept coming. You know, at first it didn't seem real. I kept thinking that the rain would stop and that, as is the case 95% of the time, the hype is much worse than the actual storm. But as I kept in close contact with this church family, the stories of preparation became stories of evacuation, which became soon stories of devastation. And I heard stories of flooded schools and businesses and homes and church families and close friends. And, of course, eventually I heard about the flooding of this building. You know, at first we didn't really know the state of most neighborhoods and homes because they were evacuated, and seeing the general flood damage was shaking. We didn't, I could see it on TV and didn't really know specifically what was going on, but I lost my breath when my friend Jake sent me this picture of the church. Now, I've shared my thoughts in that moment to you, but as I turned to my wife and I said this, when I saw this picture, I said, this is either going to kill Christ Covenant Church or it's going to be a major turning point for us. Now, I'd like to tell you that I made that statement with theological intentions and a gusto of a leader that says, seize the moment. But to be honest, I made that statement with tears in my eyes and a heavy sadness in my heart, uncertain about the future of us. Can't help but think that there was a sadness that the Israelites could relate to. You know, there are a lot of stories about suffering in the Bible, and Christians are not strangers to suffering. In fact, it's one of the promises that Jesus made, that if you follow him, you are going to suffer. But as I read the story of the Israelites who were suffering as slaves in Egypt, I see parallels to our story as a community and as a church. Now, to be honest, the situations are actually quite different. I don't want to say that it's an equivalent. To be slaves in a nation as Israel was is much worse than the suffering we went through. Not in the same category, but there are some huge parallels. There's some big parallels, specifically when it comes to suffering, when it comes to redemption, and when it comes to purpose. Let's talk about suffering first. In Exodus chapter 1, it tells the beginning of the story. Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He rose in prominence in Egypt, becoming Pharaoh's right-hand man, and his position allowed his family and himself and his 11 brothers that would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel to be rescued from a famine that was devastating the Canaan land. And so after a few generations, though, the family had grown into a quite large group of people, and the Pharaoh who gave the Israelites refuge was long gone at that point. And so with the threat of a growing foreign nation within his own borders, the new Pharaoh came up with a plan to suppress and oppress the Israelites. This is what Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 says. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And then verse 14, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage. Can you imagine a suffering in which you feel like you have no control over your life? Maybe a suffering in which the future is uncertain and at best and perhaps even perilous? Can you imagine a life where the only thing you can see in the immediate future is loss and grieving and backbreaking hard work? Sound familiar, perhaps? And this was the Israelites' response in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. I can relate to the groaning and outcries. I've made a few myself in the early days after the hurricane. I had the honor to share in some of those deep moments of grief with you, with others in this community. And our cries came up to God for us in the same way that it did for the Israelites. But listen to what happened next. Exodus 2:24. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. I love that verse. You know, as my kids have grown up, I have two standard responses to their suffering. One of them is that I just kind of shrug it off. One of the sayings my dad used to say is, I had bigger cuts than that on my lip and never stopped a whistling. If it's not bleeding, you're not dying. You're going to be okay. Shake it off. That's typically my response to their suffering, is to say, you know what, get over it. It's not a big deal. You're going to be fine. But then there are other times when I show true compassion. I really do, believe it or not. I show true compassion in that moment. I hug them and I hold them. Maybe I cry with them and I look them in the eye and I tell them that I love them. And you know what that is? It's acknowledgement. It's acknowledgement of who they are to me. It's acknowledgement that I think that their hurt is valid. And I believe in that moment when our cries went out to God, our groaning went out to God, even if it was not a vocal thing, even if it was not a physical thing, it was just a simple emotional, guttural response to what was going on around us, that God heard our crying, our outcries, and he acknowledged us, who we are to him, and also acknowledging that our hurt is valid. How blessed we were to be acknowledged by God in our suffering as he heard our cries, as he gave us comfort, just like the Israelites. So suffering is the first parallel, but then there's redemption. You may know what happened next to the Israelites. God delivered them from Egypt, but not only did he deliver them, he redeemed them in a way that could only be attributed to God himself. He made Moses an insecure murderer with a speech impediment, his spokesperson. Not exactly the guy you want to lead your campaign to get out of Egypt. He used 10 miraculous plagues, each not only to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, but also designed to expose the Egyptian gods as false gods and to show himself as the one true God. And then, of course, he parted the Red Sea so that the Israelites crossed over on dry ground and escaped the pursuing Egyptian army. And only God in that moment could receive the credit. It wasn't the Israelites, it wasn't Moses, it was only God that could have made that happen. Well, a big part of my own sorrow and concern at the heart of my cries to God was the reality of the financial status of our congregation. We are a small church with limited resources. And as of September 1st, 2017, we had a destroyed, nasty building. But you might remember what happened next. First, let me reiterate what I said last night, that we would not be here without the love and the help of individuals and churches around this country, churches that came to be with us in our time of suffering, churches that offered financial support, love, and prayers, and all sorts of things that helped us and to encourage us and to sustain us. But I want to back up a bit and retell one specific aspect of the story. You may have heard this before, but I just am amazed by this, because you know that back in 2010, I was hired as lead minister of this congregation. I started on March 15th. And one of the conditions of my hiring is that the shepherds said I needed to go to conferences, at least 3 conferences a year. They wanted to keep me fresh. They wanted to keep me fresh with ideas and moving forward. And it just so happened that in 2011, the Tulsa Workshop was one of those conferences that I went to. It doesn't exist anymore, but I went to it in 2011. And it just so happened that at that conference was Johnson University. By the way, it just so happened that in 2010, I graduated with my master's degree from Johnson University. And I always thought it might be kind of cool to do a doctorate. So, I just kind of kept my eyes open for that. And it just so happened when I went to the Johnson booth at this conference that they said, hey, guess what? There's going to be a doctorate program. And it just so happened that I approached the shepherds and said, I want to do this. And they just so happened to agree. So I started my PhD in 2012. Fast forward to 2016, and we're in a shepherds meeting. And I asked if there's any ideas for our special quarterly offering. Once a quarter, we take up an offering that's above and beyond our regular giving to help and support some missional activity or someone in need in this world. And David Trammell, a shepherd at the time, said, yeah, they just had that hurricane in Haiti. And I was wondering if there's any way that we could support the people in Haiti. Can you find an organization, Chris, that will help us do that? And it just so happened that through my PhD program, my director invited me to join a Facebook group. In that group, a couple of ministers had promoted an organization called IDES. And it just so happened that one of those conferences that I went to, the North American Christian Convention, they talked about the good work that IDES did in response to natural disasters. So I gathered the information about IDES, and the shepherds agreed that would be a great avenue to support Haiti. So in that fall, we took up an offering, and we sent it to IDES to support the people who were devastated by Hurricane Matthew in Haiti. Well, when Hurricane Harvey hit, it just so happened, as I mentioned earlier, that I was in Oklahoma. And so while we were in Oklahoma, I was chomping at the bit to do something. I felt helpless. I just got to do something. And so we decided we were going to arrange the collection of supplies. And I posted our situation to that Facebook group that I mentioned before. And it just so happened that I also sent an email to IDES. The purpose of the email was to say, hey, we're collecting stuff to go down here, clean up. You guys have done this before. What are some things we should ask for? And almost immediately I heard back from IDES, and they told me to fill out an application for a grant. And not knowing exactly what our church would need, I requested $300. You'll learn I was not a very good estimator. And IDES responded, here's $1,000. Let's start you with that. And I said, okay. And of course, they had an interaction. I talked with the project director on the phone, and he said there would likely be more funds available. So a couple weeks after that, I got in contact with him again and told him our situation here at the church building, that we were, had our no walls and basically all of our furniture and basically what was going on. And so he told me to send an estimate of our immediate repairs. And so I made some measurements. Again, this is not good. And so to see what we would need, sheetrock and paint and flooring. And my estimate came to just about $31,000. And that was, by the way, a lot more than the max that he said that they usually give to churches. He said usually they give $10,000 to $15,000 max to a church. And if you remember that day that I held up that check and said, I just so happened to have a check for $30,745.94. Well, it just so happened about a month later, I received a call from the director of shed ministries at IDES, where they give storage sheds to people who have gone through these kind of disasters. And we planned on building 30 sheds in early December. And in that conversation, he said there were actually funds available for individuals, and that we could request additional funds for the church as well. We were running over the budget there that I thought we were going to be. I thought $30,000 was enough, but we were over that, believe it or not. And so I made a request for 12 individual families and requested another $22,000 for the church, and it just so happened that we were approved. And then the team came to build the 30 sheds. We planned on setting up another trip and building even more, and I was told there might be even more funds available for individuals in the church. And so we planned on building 10 more sheds. We made a request for 20 more families and requested another $24,000 for the church, again, because I'm a horrible estimator. And we were just so happened that we were approved. And because not only am I a horrible estimator, but we were exceeding the building budget in a couple of areas, I made one final request this last October for $16,000 in assistance for the church, and we were approved. And today, we relaunch after helping 40 families with storage sheds, providing 32 families with almost $140,000 of assistance, and spending close to $145,000 to rebuild our church building with almost zero cost to us as a congregation. And so while we are thankful for the churches and individuals that made this possible? The reality is this: I can only give God credit. Just as Israel's deliverance can only be attributed to God, only through God's providence can our recovery be explained. But then there's a question that remains. And the question is this: why? Why a little bitty church in Beaumont, Texas? Why would God intervene in such incredible ways into the activities of mere human beings, both for the Israelites and us? Why would he reach down and put his finger of blessing on this congregation? It's got to be more than just to have a building, I think. Well, that comes to the third parallel here: purpose. This is what God said about his purpose for delivering the Israelites out of Egypt in Exodus 29. He said, "Then they shall know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." You see, the purpose behind God's redemption of Israel was simply an extension of God's overall purpose. Israel was chosen as God's people because he wanted the world to see what it was like to be in a covenant relationship with him. And God redeemed them from slavery so they could proclaim his power and glory to the world. And this is what Psalm 107 says: "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those who redeemed from the hands of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from the east and west, from north and south." And this was the purpose that God had for the Israelites: to continue his purposes by giving thanks and by telling their story of redemption. I wonder if God might have provided for us the way he did for a similar reason. What do you think, Mike?
I think we need to play a rebuild. We're celebrating growth. I don't know if you noticed, we had to set up extra chairs this morning. Did you notice that? We were throwing extra chairs down. I think that's phenomenal. And that's I hate to say this, but that's not to celebrate the leadership team. That's to celebrate the head of this church, which is Jesus Christ. Amen? That's who we're celebrating this morning. And you can't listen to this story of redemption at Christ Covenant Church without asking the question, what's next? And in order to answer that question, we've got to play Would You Rather. So this is going to take a little bit of participation. A little bit of you don't have to stand up. You don't have to turn to your neighbor and say anything. I hate it when that happens. But anyway, just listen to the question, and then you can answer. Would you rather live in a house that is shaped like a circle or a triangle? Raise your hand if it's circle. Raise your hand for triangle. Okay? All right. Now, would you rather visit the International Space Station for a week or stay in an underwater hotel? Space station. Underwater hotel. Whoa, we got to do that again. Space station. Some of you even rethought and revoted. Underwater hotel. Yeah, I'm with you on the underwater hotel. I can't do without Netflix. Okay, what about, would you rather the superhuman ability to text quickly or to speed read? Text quickly. Good. I like it. Speed read. There we go. We've got, this church is really intelligent. How come you were so far off on the estimate? Okay, all right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, he'll get me back later. This is going to be back and forth. All right, now think about the next questions for a second here. Would you rather God bless every person at Christ Covenant Church with predictable comfort or powerful change? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands to that. Because you're sitting in cushioned chairs this morning. Would you rather God bless every single one of us here at this church with predictable comfort or powerful change? Now, some of you are honest enough to say, honestly, I don't know. I think I've had enough powerful change for 1 year. So let me ask you one more question. And the way you answer this question, I don't want feedback right now. I want this to be something you answer between you and God. Because I've had to ask myself this question. Olivia and I have been asking ourselves this question for years. And I believe it's led us to the point of coming out here to Beaumont, Texas. Would you rather God bring the kind of people we want, or would you rather God lead us to the kind of people we need? Well, I'll ask a better question. We've asked what would we rather, what would you rather? What about what would Jesus rather? Okay, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. our opinions really don't matter at the end of the day. They're important to each other as we learn each other and learn how to love each other, but at the end of the day, the question should be, what would Jesus rather? And in 2 Timothy chapter 3, we get the answer. Jesus speaks through one of the Apostle Paul's farewell letters. It's actually pretty emotional if you think about it. One of the last letters he wrote to his son in the faith, whose name was Timothy. And recorded in our English translations under 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, we get this list of difficult times that are going to be ahead for the disciples, including us to this day and now 2019. And the Apostle Paul warns that there's going to be trouble. He doesn't say we get a free ride, just a get out of hell free card and off we go to heaven. He says, no, there's going to be difficult times up ahead. I believe God is not an idealist but a realist. That's what I see in Scripture. 2 Timothy chapter 3, the last part of verse 4, warns that at the end of the day, the people we're going to be around, including ourselves, have a tendency to be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Jesus would rather us be lovers of himself than lovers of our own preferences. And we're going to have to recommit to that over and over again. Matter of fact, the way Jesus puts it is that we take up our cross. How often? Daily. Every 24 hours, we take up our cross again. We raise our hand and say, yes, Lord, I'm committed. I'm surrendered to you. And we're not without an example on this. In Romans chapter 5, verse 8, we read that God demonstrated his love toward us because while we were still sinning, while we were still breaking his heart, while we were still breaking his laws, he died for us. Powerful change over predictable comfort, wouldn't you say? That's the example he gave. He's not asking us to go anywhere he hasn't already gone. So what would Jesus rather? Now, buckle in tight for this one. This one's going to be controversial. What would Jesus rather? He would rather us do his works than merely discuss his doctrines. Now be careful with how you run with that today. I know how lunchtime Sunday afternoon conversations go. I know how they go. Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said? Listen, I know when the church started, we read in Acts and the second part of Luke, if you will, we read that what did the church do? They continued in the apostles' doctrine. That was essential. That was important. It is essential. It is important. But listen to this. I'm asking, what would Jesus rather? He would rather we would obey his actions than merely discuss his doctrine. I am so grateful for each and every one of you that are here. I know there's some who weren't able to make it, and so I'll wave at you on the camera here because this is on YouTube. We put this online, and that's a resource of ministry. But listen, this is just the beginning. This is just the pep talk. We're just getting started. The question we have to ask that Chris has been building up to and Christ has been leading this church to is, what is our purpose? And we got to take a little breather. Now, I know I say we, and to be honest, I feel like the worker who comes in at 5 o'clock to finish the evening shift, and you all have been working since 5 in the morning. You put in a long, hard day, blood, sweat, and tears, and I feel like I'm coming in at the end. So let me ask you this. Would you rather stop after the storm and relax, or use the momentum of God's blessing to bless others? Now, there's cycles of rest. We can't burn ourselves out, or this church is going to end up returning to a circle of people leaving because the ministry starts falling apart because people are burned out. You know the burnout stories, right? You know the burnout stories, not just in ministry, but in family and in work. We don't need to burn this church out. We need to take a Sabbath rest as a part of our cycle, and that's what we're going to do over the next several months. We're going to be considering, what is the purpose of this church? Where are we going? Formulating a vision, seeking Christ to lead us. But I'm asking you, would you rather pass on these blessings or retain them? I'll be honest with you, I'd rather be a blessing to others. That's why we moved out here, because I saw God working out here. Olivia and I were at a place in ministry where we were at a crossroads. We had burned ourselves out. I had burned myself out, and subsequently, Olivia took twice the load of stress that I did, and I didn't realize it at the time. You know that story. And so we were at a crossroads. Do we continue in ministry, or could I just go back to either aircraft industry or construction or something I was a little more familiar with? And so we went to a church where we could stay as long as we wanted and consider all the options. And we put everything back on the table. We said, Lord, we'll go any place. We'll do any type of ministry. And out of all of that, there was a light beam of faith that came all the way out from Beaumont, Texas, that called to us. And we believe God called us to this church. We don't believe at this point in time that this church is a stepping stone. We believe this church is a home. You ask anybody who knows me, I'm a straight shooter. We believe this church is a home. And so I want to be with you in this momentum of God moving forward to bless others. If you look at Matthew chapter 20, verses 8 through 16, you see this parable I was referencing earlier, where a farm manager goes out and he hires some workers, and he starts early in the morning before the break of dawn, as the workday would have been sunrise to sunset. And he starts getting workers early in the morning, and then he gets some around 9 o'clock in the morning, and then he goes out around lunchtime, and then the union break at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then he gets the last crew at 5 o'clock in the evening. And at the end of the workday, everybody's sweaty and tired. The ones who started early in the morning are the sweatiest. I'm going to make up two words. You okay? The sweatiest and the tiredest. I can say tiredest. All right, we're done. Let's keep moving. Matthew chapter 20, verses 8 through 16. Something odd happens. The farm manager has the paycheck as a day's wages. Today it'd be about $75, minimum wage. And he walks over and he hands this $75 to every single one of the workers, whether they showed up at 5 in the morning or whether they showed up at 5 in the evening. He gave them all about $75. And of course, the guys who were there since 5 in the morning say, "What is going on? We were here longer than them." And the boss man said, "You agreed to work for this $75. What, am I ripping you off? You agreed to work for that." I feel like I'm the guy that's coming in at 5 o'clock in the evening right now. I don't feel worthy to be a part of this celebration. I'm just being honest with you for a second. But you have accepted us to be a part of this story. So could I encourage you with this? We're just the beginning of that. We need to keep inviting other individuals and families to be a part of where we're going next. Because I'm going to unlock a little secret for you. It's going to be easy to let resentment settle in when other families start coming in and being a part of this church, and you're going to want to cross your arms a little bit and say, "Hey, you weren't here when? You didn't put those cabinets up. You didn't tear out that moldy sheetrock. You weren't here when we didn't know if we were even going to have a church. You've got it easy." Okay, let's look at this parable for a second, because something interesting happens at the end. Jesus flips our concept on its head. Matthew chapter 20, verse 16, we read, "So the last will be first, and the first will be last." I'm going to start back in verse 9. Matthew chapter 20, verse 9, now that we've set up this verse. "When those who were hired about 5 in the morning came, they each received 1 denarius. So when the first ones came, they assumed they would get more, but they also received a denarius." That's at $75 day's wage. "When they received it, they began to complain to the landowner." Verse 12, "These last men put in 1 hour, and you made them equal to us who bore the burden of the day and the burning heat." He replied to them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree to work with me for a denarius? Take what's yours and go. I want to give the last man the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my business? Are you jealous because I'm generous?" So, Jesus says, he summarizes this story, this earthly story with a heavenly meaning. He says, "So the last will be first, and the first last." I'm not going to pretend to interpret what that means for Christ Covenant Church. I just see this principle at play. We can't be resentful of who God's going to bring into this church, because I believe he's going to continue bringing more people into the church, because he's done it ever since I have been here. And even when I came in October, I was seeing changes taking place in this church. That train is already going. God's momentum, God's story, God's plan is already moving. The question is, are we going to be a part of that redemption? We can't get stuck in one place in time, and I don't see that happening. I just want to make us aware, because we want to be a part of it. You know, no leader is perfect. Being a leader unveils a whole new potential for evil and for good. Now, you might not think of Johnny Cash as a great leader. We all know his faults, all right? We all know his faults. But Johnny Cash was a man who was blessed with talent, and he decided to bless others with that talent. He was blessed, and he decided to take those blessings and bless others. He was a conduit. He was a channel of blessing, even with all of his faults. And he was performing at San Quentin Prison. He performed there several times. But one time, there was a 20-year-old young man who was serving his time. He was a thief, this young man. The branded man was serving his time while Johnny Cash performed. The young branded man thought his life was over and he would spend the rest of his days in prison. But Johnny Cash, with all of his faults and flaws, blessed with this skill, decided to bless others. And Merle Haggard, 20 years old, Merle Haggard was there in that audience, and he decided to come out of that cycle of crime and out of that cycle of poverty. And even with his flaws, he went on to bless others with music that spoke to real life situations and blessed many people and pulled many people out of their own cycles of poverty and cycles of crime. Just brought beautiful, what I consider to be beautiful poetry into music. I remember where I was when I heard that Merle Haggard had passed away. He's one of my favorites. Yes, I have him on vinyl records. Who knows what a record is? We got, okay, all right. How about cassette tapes? Who knows what? Okay, good. We still have a VHS player. Everybody okay? Okay, we're okay. All right. I think Tolly was okay. Okay, we got a few. I remember where I was. I was driving my 1994 Chevy Z71 out on the red dirt roads of Cherokee County, Kansas in April of 2016 when I heard the news that Merle Haggard had passed away. And, you hear about these celebrity deaths and some they just kind of come and go. But for whatever reason, that one really hit me sideways because I really loved his music. I loved his style. I loved his poetry. But what got me was as the DJ was playing Mama Tried, the DJ came on and turned the music down a little bit and shared one of Merle Haggard's final quotes. Merle Haggard had been diagnosed with cancer in 2008, years before he died, and about that time, Merle Haggard continued to grow closer to Jesus Christ and continued to renew his testimony. And one thing Merle said that stuck with me, he said, "It's almost embarrassing to know that the Lord cares that much for me, but I'm going to shout it to the world." Listen, these men I've mentioned, they've got their flaws. I know that. But I really appreciate that statement because I know I struggle to shout it to the world. I struggle to shout it to the world. And I know some of you have made comments that you almost feel guilty for having recovered from this hurricane and so many people are suffering. Well, don't feel guilty. Shout what God has done for you to the world. And then let's go and repeat that again and repeat it again. Let's go do what God has done for us. Let's go do that for others. It's not a complicated mystery. You don't need to buy a book about this. What's been done to us, let's go and do that to others. God used individuals and ministry to bless us. Jesus told us that everyone who will acknowledge me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. Chris talked about that a little bit earlier. Acknowledgement. Sometimes this first step is getting ready to close the message. Sometimes this first step is acknowledging that other people are still in pain. You don't have to feel guilty that you've recovered. Use the fact that God has blessed you. Now acknowledge those who are still in pain, those who are still recovering, those who now are either unemployed or underemployed, those who are still in the middle of a reconstruction that they ran out of funds for. Acknowledge that pain and see if maybe those aren't open doors for ministry into our community. Redeemed to redeem. This church has been redeemed even before the building was ever reconstructed. Amen? This building reconstruction is a shining example of redemption that people can understand. It helps me to understand just a little bit better. So I'm going to encourage you to do something. We're going to have several challenges this morning, but here's a simple one for this week. I'm going to ask you, like Merle Haggard said, to shout this goodness to the world. It may not be about the church building itself, because we need to think beyond the church building. This is where we get our pep talks. This is where we come together, and then we go back out. So I'm going to encourage you sometime this week, whether you use Snapchat or Facebook, or you just want to write it down on a Post-it note, write down how God has redeemed you. Now, I've got an example on the slide of what I posted this last Thursday. I don't know if you can really see it up there or not. I said, I'm so grateful Jesus redeemed me 10 years ago to pursue ministry. I don't feel worthy, but I continue to see Him move in powerful ways. Put something simple like that. Shout it out to the world. Maybe put it on a Post-it note to yourself. Send it in a text message to those you care about. Send it in an email. Make a statement of how God has redeemed you personally. Because we're not going to understand redemption as a collective body of Christ until we understand how He has redeemed us individually. So that's your individual challenge for any time later this week. But before we get to that, Chris has several ways and methods we can, as a collective body, share how Christ has redeemed us as Christ Covenant Church. Chris?
Redeem to redeem. That's the focus. The purpose behind we have the blessings that we do, the purpose behind what God has done. So this morning, we're going to have a little bit of time of organized chaos. We're going to share some steps that we want you to take this morning, interactive steps, and we're going to tell you, I'm going to walk you through what we're going to do, and you don't have to do all of them. You don't have to do them all in this order, but we want you to participate as much as God leads you to do so. The very first step is I've asked the congregation to compose letters of their experience over the past year plus and what God has done for them. And we're going to put that in a box, and we're going to put it in the foyer in a shadow box. Now, I mentioned the Israelites and their deliverance from Egypt. If you remember, if you look at the book of Exodus, God gave them a list of things they were to do to remember. They call it the Passover. And that was to continually remind them of what God had done. And this is the first step, to remember and to celebrate that we are redeemed. And so, if you consider yourself to be a part of this congregation, we encourage you to go right over to this station and drop your letter, if you have it, into that open box. But then what we want you to do is we want you to sign the top of the box that's next to it. Now, remember, this is not the Constitution, and there are no John Hancocks here, so keep it small enough that everybody can get their name on that box. We want you to sign that box so that we can put that out in the foyer that you were a part of this. Now, by the way, if you don't have your letter with you right now and you need to turn it in later, that's fine. You can go over and still sign the box in preparation for that. So that is the first step, is to remember that we have been redeemed and what God has done for us. But the work continues, even though the work has stopped perhaps in the building, the work continues.
And one of the things we want to look at as we move forward is going to be small groups, and there's different names for this, but specifically because the theme is going to be on purpose. That's what we're moving forward with. On purpose. We're going to call these purpose groups because this church has gone through several identities over its life, and that's good. That's a wonderful thing, but we serve a God who transforms us. Amen? And this is another step of transformation, and we want to be in on it together as a church. So the other thing we'll have is sign-up sheets are over here, correct? I got the right table. There's a lot of tables. This is good stuff. Good stuff. Once you have put your letter and signed the top of the lid, then come over here for small group sign-ups. Now, there's different days of the week and different times and different locations. And just look at it, think about it, pray about it for a few seconds, and then sign up. Sign up. Sign up for a small group. And even if you're not sure that you can be 100% committed yet, I'm a recovering perfectionist, so I won't hold your feet to the fire. I said I'm a recovering perfectionist. Normally when I say I'm a recovering, I hold it and just see how people react. I'm a recovering perfectionist. Okay, but come over here, sign up for one of these small groups. We'll be doing these for 3 months, all right? We don't want to burn anybody out. We don't want you to be overwhelmed, but we do need to be together more than just Sunday. We need a chance to kind of relax a little bit, just share what's going on in life, and then bring it under the umbrella of what Christ is teaching us. So I would just encourage you, you can just make your way from that table to this table, sign up for a purpose group. That'll be a 3-month commitment, and then we will get back with you and help coordinate how all that's going to go down. And then after we do the weekly groups, the purpose groups, we've got another challenge from Chris right after you're done with that table.
So we want to make a visual of kind of where our influence is. You know, Jesus said that we are salt and light. We want to show where our salt and light exists. And so over here we have a map of Hardin County and Jefferson County. If you live in Orange County or another county, I'm so sorry that we couldn't fit your county on there too. What we want you to do is there are 2 pins. The blue pins we want you to mark where you live. Poke the pin into where you live. Try to get it as exact as you can, and if you're off by a little bit, then you fail. I'm just kidding. Just kind of, I know Bob Foster had his Google Maps thing out, was trying to figure out exactly where to put his pin. So put your pin in a general location where you live. Take the green one. Underneath it says green go, wherever you go. So if you have a job, put it where you work. If you have a school, put it where you go to school. If you have a hobby that you do on a regular basis or a place you volunteer on a regular basis, put that there too. And that way we can kind of see where we are. And if you're not on that map, again, sorry, Orange County people, you can go over there and just kind of put it off to the side and, you know, make a little note that that's the case. So we want you to do that, and we're going to be using that to show us where our influence rests. And after that, because we have more work to do, we have one last activity. Go for it.
Well, so again, we've started over here, we've made a line, you've put in your letters, you've signed the box, you've walked past the beautiful refurbished communion table, which was awesome. And then you come over here and you've picked your small group, you put your pins as Chris instructed, then you can circle back around either behind the table or cause a traffic jam and bottleneck over here. And then you can come grab a hat anywhere along the stage, because we're not necessarily we are gonna pose for a picture, right?
Yeah, we're gonna recreate. If you remember, with the first picture we took after we had our first service in this building, we bought a bunch of these construction hats and took a picture right here. Right here is where the picture was. And so it's only fair to recreate that on our relaunch weekend. So,
and the reason we're recreating this is because the work's not finished yet. The work is not finished yet. We are putting these helmets on, even for those of us who came in at the end of the work shift. We are collectively putting these work hats on because we have a new work to do. We don't know exactly what it's going to be. You all didn't know exactly what this work was going to look like when you started this. But God knew, and He provided, and He paved the way, and He brought the people in that you needed. And that's what we're going to, in faith, we're going to make this statement as was read during the scripture reading this morning, that there is a new work. There is a new work that God's going to do. This is a statement of faith that it's going to be a work even better than what He's done. I know that's hard to believe, but that's the kind of God we serve. That's the kind of story He writes. He's the author and finisher of our faith.
And I'll just add, let's say that maybe you are from someplace like, I don't know, Kentucky, and you're sitting here going, well, why didn't they do anything so we could play too? Well, you can get a hat too. We want everybody in this room to be in this picture because we all have work to do. And so at the very least, we want everyone to join us in the front.
Here we go. 1, 2,